Ann Perret is back again here in the KRQE News 13 digital studio here today to talk about her latest follow-up investigation. This is in regards to two people in Taos County who are facing child abuse charges, and we'll get into more about that story here. Ann, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, so again, I mentioned this is a follow-up. If you haven't seen the initial story, it's worth checking out, and we'll put a link to that in the post on this discussion at krqe.com. But let's just basically jump into it. There have been developments essentially in this case of a child abuse situation that happened in Taos County. The two suspects in this case are Heidi Velasquez and Adrian Vigil. And as I understand, they adopted a son who they are accused of abusing for a period of about 6 months. That's where some of your first reporting revolved around. But I wanted to ask you about the latest chapter here. This family was supposed to have a trial here shortly, but you heard of a plea deal being offered in this case, which is presented in your story, right?
Correct, yes. And this plea deal came to the judge. It was presented to the judge just less than a week before trial was expected. I mean, subpoenas had been sent out, and they were prepared for trial.
Okay.
But the two sides, prosecutor, defense attorneys, worked together to get this plea deal in front of the judge. Huge change in tune from the DA's office. From 2 years ago when they issued these charges, you're looking at Heidi Velasquez. Adrian was not in the courtroom for this hearing. He actually appeared virtually from California, where he was working. But they were facing 45 years in prison on 3 child abuse charges. Again, as you mentioned, accused of abusing, torturing is the word in the criminal complaint, this young boy that they adopted, toddler at the time, for at least 6 months. And now probation is on the table for these two. So that's what really kind of caught our attention. And, we went up to Taos for that hearing, and we're there in person in the courtroom to kind of watch the arguments for this deal.
Okay, so we mentioned a little bit about the two suspects involved in this case, Heidi Velasquez, Adrian Vigil, but I wanted to just sort of put this in a question form. What has happened since their arrest? I know one of the big things that happened was, it sounds like there was some level of a reunification that happened here, but I'll leave it to you to explain what has happened since their initial arrest and the procedural process of this trial has started to play out.
Right, reunification is correct. That is done on the civil side of things. It's kind of a custody case, if you will, done through the Child, Youth, and Families Department. That happens simultaneously. That process, this reunification process, happens simultaneously as the criminal case plays out. That is what my first investigation focused on. That aired in December. That's when unsupervised visits started, meaning the boy was placed back in his adoptive parents' home prior to their criminal case being closed. So these allegations, these accusations are still out there that they did horrific things to this child, and they were allowed to have him back in their home. Now, that first investigation kind of goes into more depth about what that process is. This isn't just a willy-nilly decision. CYFD says, there's a lot of therapy, a lot of behavior changes that they have to see, and ultimately it is the judge's decision. It's actually the exact same judge from this criminal case that is overseeing the other case. So he's very privy to all the behavior changes that they've made, all the improvements that they've made. But yes, he has been in their home since December. That's when the unsupervised visits started with a weekend, went to a week. I believe he was there for the full week of Christmas, and then he's been there full time for the last few months.
Okay.
So what I do want to note with that, I interviewed CYFD back in the fall for that December investigation. Right. And I do think it's important to note that they said, there are still checks and balances in place until that custody case is closed, which unfortunately I'm not privy to that information because that's just not, it's not shared. Yes, yeah. It's protected. But once that case is closed, CYFD's jurisdiction over that boy is done. But until it's closed, they can still do these check-ins, ensure that the therapy, everything is still happening for those parents and for the child, kind of that family therapy, if you will, as well. But we do know as well from CYFD, once it is closed, even though their jurisdiction is ended, the family can still ask for their help for up to 6 months afterwards, any support that they need. But again, we're not privy to that with this family's specific situation.
Got you. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about your current investigation, which really centers around the fact that this plea deal had been offered and you were there inside of the courtroom. Do you know how the prosecution arrived on this point? Because I think it is probably going to be striking to some people who hear this story that you have these allegations of abuse and the criminal punishment is severe, potentially, if convicted by a jury. But then the deal was far different. So to the question, how was this? Do you know how this deal maybe was arrived on?
From my understanding, it really does appear that this reunification that happened in December became a huge piece, one of the biggest arguments for saying that they should be receiving a lesser sentence. I mean, probation for both of them was suggested to the judge by the prosecutor in a hearing prior to this plea hearing because the boy's back in their home. This would be traumatic for him if he were to be taken away from them. It would hurt him more than them was the argument. He loves his family. So that's really what it appeared to be the big reason. Now, the Taos County Sheriff's Office, which investigated this case and is privy to all of the gruesome details, as they say, they were not aware of the plea. That's unusual. They're typically informed, and a plea is typically run by them ahead of time. I actually called to see if they would be at the hearing, and they were like, what hearing? We weren't aware that there was a plea. So,
wow.
They ended up showing up to this hearing and weren't too happy because of the details that they know. So, they argued anybody can change their behavior, right, when they're facing 45 years in prison. So could you look at that, Judge, and see, what is their motivation? So
very interesting. So, as you covered in your story, the judge ended up rejecting this deal. I know you have a soundbite in there about sort of his explanation, but I was hoping perhaps you could flesh out a little bit more about what did the judge say about why he was rejecting this deal?
Well, for one, the dad, Adrian V. Hill, he was going to be receiving a much lesser sentence, a third-degree felony compared to first-degree felonies. And his wife, Heidi, who you're seeing on screen right now, she was only going to get, or she would be receiving a second degree. He said that's not fair. We can't pin these two against each other. He's not going to allow Adrian to say that he wasn't aware. And so he said they have to, first of all, get the same plea. He listened to the undersheriff who said, what is the motivation? He questioned that. And something else that I thought was really interesting, mid-hearing, he had the bailiff leave and go get him a manila envelope. I mean, it was thick, of photos and of the UNM doctor's report about the abuse. And he sat there and looked through all of these photos we haven't seen because they're protected. And he said, I still can't understand what the explanation is for these injuries. He mentioned too, the resource parent, as they're called, the parent who takes custody of the child temporarily when they're released from the hospital. He said that resource parent didn't see these same injuries that you guys are talking about because their defense is he did this to himself. The child did these injuries to himself. This child had pre-existing injuries. And he said, this resource parent never mentioned any of this, so that is confusing. And on top of that, he said the resource parent threw out an allegation to the judge that there was a taser found in the diaper bag when it was handed to him. So the judge needed an explanation on that as well. You know, the whole, this happening over a period of 6 months, not just happening one time. He said, I just have trouble with the thought that this wasn't intentional, just a lot of things not adding up. So he had some frustrations, and I think needed a little bit more explanation.
Yeah, I know, you know, in your story, we obviously heard from the prosecution giving their explanation of sort of what took place in this case, maybe perhaps why it took place. But I wanted to ask you about the defense's side of things, because obviously there are defense attorneys for the suspects here as well. What do the defense have to say about this case?
Well, as I mentioned, so the adoptive dad, Adrian Vigil, he was going to be pleading to a much lesser charge, just a third-degree felony. The argument there being that he wasn't the primary caretaker, he was working 2 jobs, so he wasn't really at home, he wasn't privy to any of the information about this abuse, he never saw it. So that's his defense's side, is he was oblivious, he didn't know. He couldn't have done this, right? And then Heidi Velasquez's attorney mentions kind of what the prosecutor does, that about 13 years ago, they lost one of their children, Vigil and Velasquez. One of their children died, which is, I mean, of course, a horrible thing, right? But he said she was still suffering from depression and PTSD from that. And so she just couldn't handle this child, who we know from my first story does have developmental delays. He was born with meth in his system. And he does have a few challenges, right? But so her attorney said, you know, she just couldn't keep up, and you know, none of this was intentional. And they both also mentioned these pre-existing injuries, as I mentioned, which the judge didn't seem to buy, right? But he also mentioned the reunification piece of it, as the prosecutor did. He said, you know, when you see this boy with them, he loves them. This would be more harmful to him than to them to take him away. So, yeah, the judge did ask for records proving any of these pre-existing injuries that they're talking to. And one other thing that I thought was interesting, Velasquez's attorney mentioned that the doctors who saw the child when he was first brought to the hospital, and who make the determination that yes, this was child abuse and somebody did this to him. Velasquez's attorney says, you know, these were inferences made, and they were comparing him to a, quote, normal child, comparing his injuries to a normal child, not to a child who had the developmental delays and potentially other pre-existing injuries that this child did. So what's going to happen here is they are going to be presenting witnesses to kind of prove all of their defense. It's not like testimony at a pretrial or at a pretrial preliminary exam type of thing. This will be at the sentencing to just try to argue after that plea, you know, that you shouldn't sentence them to the max.
Yeah.
You should be lowering the number of years.
Mitigation is sometimes what it's referred to in the court system, but yeah, essentially that testimony there to add some more context about how the judge should consider to sentence them. Interesting.
Yes.
So what is next? I understand there's a couple matters swirling in here. There's a civil case tied to this. We also know that there's obviously this criminal case, which we've been talking all about. But what do you expect to happen next here?
So the judge said he would only accept a plea of child abuse resulting in great bodily harm for both of them, or he said he may consider attempted child abuse, that charge. So they're now going back to the table, the prosecution and defense attorneys, trying to figure out here what they can come up with there, a new deal that will then be presented to the judge for the judge to look over. Then there will be a plea hearing again where I guess if they do what he asked for, right, he will accept that plea because he did reject this one. So we would expect him to accept that. Then there will be a sentencing hearing, which could last all day because, again, that mitigation will be happening.
Yeah.
So a lot still in this case that's now more than 2 years old.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, yeah, from what I'm hearing from you, it sounds like there is this sort of divide between the idea of reunification and also accountability for what happened here. So, and those things don't always intersect, so to speak, and that's really what I feel like this story sort of speaks to. So
yeah, it's interesting, and I mean that's why it caught our attention, right? The reunification in the first place happening before their criminal case was closed, which the Taos County Sheriff's Office, again, who investigated this case, was upset about in December that this child was going back into their home. But then to now see that it's being used almost as justification for not holding them accountable, if you will, for the accusations against them. This was their argument that reunification can be postponed. It can be delayed. Yes, it should be happening legally. It has to happen at the exact same time as the criminal case plays out. But the undersheriff says, you know, they really should have postponed this until this case came to a close. Perfect example why right here.
Wow. Well, and how can people reach you if they've got any comments or tips that they can share with you?
You can always email me at ann.perrett@krqe.com. Find me on Twitter, any social media, Facebook, Instagram. It's at Ann Perrett.
Okay. Ann, thanks again.
Thanks for having me, Chris.